Here's a woman who wakes up before dawn. She comes downstairs and she makes coffee. She packs the kids' lunches. She makes them breakfast. She gets them all cleaned up and dressed. She packs them in the car one at a time. Someone left a shoe. She goes back and grabs it. She chauffeurs them all around to all their activities. She comes home. She folds the laundry while one kid takes a nap. She cleans the kitchen. She teaches them patiently. She reads a story with them. She helps the older ones with their math homework. She makes dinner. She cleans the kitchen again. She gets on her hands and knees on the living room carpet and plays with the kids. She makes them a snack. She puts them to bed and reads them another story. She cleans the kitchen again. And just as she's drifting off to sleep in those blessed hours, she wakes with a jolt at the sound of a tiny fist knocking on her door saying, "Mommy, Mommy, Mommy." And she's got a throwing up kid, and so she gives them medicine, and she stays up an extra 3 or 4 hours, and she finally gets maybe 3.5, 4 hours of fitful rest before she wakes up and has to do it all over again. Needed by everyone, but seemingly seen by no one. And maybe you felt that way before. Maybe you're not a mother, but maybe you were scrolling through photos of a party that you didn't get invited to. Maybe you find yourself eating dinner alone again and again and again. Maybe you were passed over at work while someone who is louder takes all the credit and the promotion that goes along with it. There is a kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but by being overlooked, of just moving through the world convinced that no one really sees you. And I wonder if you felt that before in some way. Well, if you have, there's a story. It's the story that Austin read for us in Genesis chapter 16. It's a story about this runaway slave. Her name was Hagar. She was pregnant. She was afraid. She had fled into the desert. She had nowhere left to go. And she thought that she was completely alone, but she discovered there a God who saw her. And she gave him a name. She gave him this name, El Roi, the God who sees, the God who sees me. So I thought we'd work through that story, and then we would take some time and just apply it to our lives. Again, just to get the text in front of us again, we'll just work through the story verse by verse, verses 1 to 3. You have the dilemma of Sarai. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. So a little context here. God had made several promises to Abram years ago, 10 years ago. And these promises required Abram have children, that he have a future beyond himself. But here he's been in the land of Canaan, to which he was called to live for 10 years in verse 3, and still he had no kids. And Sarai is interpreting her circumstances and saying, well, it looks like God has prevented me from having children, and so she makes her move. A little human intervention to kind of help God's promise along. And her fix for barrenness is slave surrogacy. She had a slave from Egypt, from their time in Egypt. This may seem strange to us, but this wasn't actually that strange. In the ancient Near East, this was fairly common. At least it was common enough in that culture that we have one Assyrian tablet from the 19th century BC that actually dictated that if a wife didn't produce children for her husband within 2 years, she could buy a slave and sell her off after the slave had a kid. So that's her plan, verses 3 and 4. But what is acceptable in culture may also be reprehensible to God. And their actions here illustrate the lengths that we go to sometimes in our foolishness, in our impatience to try to control our own lives. While Abram and Sarai disappoint us, try to look at this from Hagar's point of view. Doesn't your heart go out to this woman? I mean, where is she in all of this? What choice did this woman have? She's a slave. She's been taken away from home. She's far, hundreds of miles from anyone she knows. And she's being used as a means to an end. Just try to see the story from her perspective. So you have the dilemma of Sarai. Then we have verses 4 to 6. You have the disdain of Hagar. Verses 4 to 6. And Abram went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she'd conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. So here Hagar gets pregnant, seemingly right away. At least that's the way the story kind of tells. And she gives Sarai this haughty look. She treats her with contempt, or she despises her, almost like she'd been promoted and Sarai had been demoted in the family. And this fragile arrangement just shatters. There's all of these emotions you could imagine. And Sarai then lays into Abram and blames Abram for the whole thing for some reason. And Abram, great leader that he is, completely wimps out and concedes and just tells Sarai to do whatever she wants to her servant. I remember the first time I read Genesis, and I thought, wait, this is the Bible? Here I thought the Bible was telling me all these great things that I'm supposed to do. And here's Abram, this great patriarch, this man of faith, and look at him behaving in this cowardly way. He's being a terrible leader. Well, the patriarchs, as you read, are not always the most positive family role models. And sometimes, what Scripture records, it doesn't necessarily recommend. In fact, even though the writer doesn't come out and say, this is sinful, this is wrong, you shouldn't do this, he's banking on us being wise enough to read the rest of the story and see, hey, maybe this is a bad idea. In fact, the writer subtly draws us back with the language that he uses to Adam and Eve's sin in the garden. He signals it in 3 ways. First, Sarai is described as Abram's wife, and Abram is described as her husband. We already know that. We've been talking about these people since chapter 12. Why tell us again? Well, it reminds us of the covenant of marriage that God designed from the very beginning. Genesis 2, verse 24. And they're violating that covenant. They're going outside of that boundary. We're also told here that Abram, verse 2, listened to the voice of Sarai, his wife. Well, doesn't that echo God's rebuke of Adam for listening to the voice of his wife Eve when she did something foolish and sinful? And then we also have Sarai taking something that didn't belong to her and giving it to her husband. Verse 3, well, doesn't that echo exactly the same language of Eve's actions and taking this forbidden fruit and giving some to her husband to eat? Again, if you are attuned to that language, you would hear those echoes of Eden. Very, very similar to what happened in Genesis chapter 3. And just like in Genesis chapter 3, it results in sin and separation. Sarai dealt harshly with Hagar, and Hagar ran away. Now, when you see that word dealt harshly, That's actually foreshadowing something that's going to happen to Abram's descendants. That word comes from the same root word that was used later for Egypt's violent oppression of Israel when they were enslaved under Pharaoh in Exodus chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. You see the word affliction later. It's the same word. So this wasn't just a cross word here that Sarai had with Hagar. This is a harsh treatment. Hagar understandably runs away, maybe back toward Egypt. We're told that she's found by this spring on the way to Shur. Shur, we're not sure where Shur is, but it seems like it's on the way down to Egypt. So she may have been on her way home, but she didn't have any real plans, didn't have any protection. She has no real future. And so we move from the disdain of Hagar to the discovery of God in verses 7 to 16. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from? And where are you going? And she said, I'm fleeing from my mistress, Sarai. And the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God of seeing. For she said, truly, there I have seen him who looks after me. Therefore the well was called Beer Lahairoi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. So she's found by this spring of water. By who? By God? By an angel? It's the angel of the Lord 4 times in verses 7 to 11. But in verse 13, that suggests that it's the Lord himself, or at least some kind of representative in visible form. But what I want you to see is the compassion of God here. Do you see that? You see the care of God? I mean, zoom out again and try to imagine the big picture here. Who are the major players in Genesis? Is it Hagar? Or is it Abram and Sarai, who would become Abraham and Sarah? Right? Hagar is not instrumental in the progression of God's eternal plan of redemption, bringing Jesus into the world to bless all nations, right? That promise comes through Abram and Sarai. Hagar just gets thrown into this mess because she just happens to be a slave. But I want you to see, God still cares for her. He sees her. He takes time to appear to her, to visit her in her distress. And he even knows her by name. In verse 8, he addresses her by her name, Hagar. Do you know, to my knowledge, this might be the only instance in any ancient Near Eastern literature where a deity addresses a woman by name. And that's what we see here. But then what does God do? What does he tell her to do in verse 9? He tells her to go back and submit to Sarai. And we're thinking to ourselves, why would a loving God do such a thing? If God really knew, if God really had seen how terrible it was with Sarai, why send her back? And here we need to be careful. We need to check ourselves against presuming to know better than God or to be more compassionate than God. Hagar still had a responsibility, and you can see that subtly in the way that the angel of the Lord addresses her. Hagar, the servant of Sarai. You're still the servant of Sarai. This reminds me a little bit of Paul. Paul, he also met a runaway slave in his day. And his name was Onesimus. And he had run away from his master Philemon. Philemon was a Christian. Onesimus wasn't. Onesimus runs away, runs into Paul, hears the gospel, becomes a Christian. And what does Paul say? Onesimus, you got to go back. But here, hold this letter and give it to your master, who reminds him that he's coming back not just as a slave, but as a brother. who's really useful to you. It reminds me of that story. But here the Lord sends Hagar back to Sarai, not with a letter in her hand, but with a blessing. He's going to make her a multitude from her offspring. Verse 10, very, very similar promise that God had given to Abram and Sarai. And he tells her to name her son that she's pregnant with Ishmael, which means God listens, God hears, because he's listened to her in her affliction. God sees her, God hears her. What no one else bothered to notice, God has seen and heard. And so Hagar, she names this well here, or she names God El Roi, the God who sees, because God saw her and she saw him. I've seen the God who looks after me, who sees me. And evidently she told other people about her encounter, because this well became known as Bir Lahai Roi, the well of the living one who sees me, reminding every parched traveler who's on their way to Shur that this God sees them. Well, what does it mean to us, this story? You know, God is not just all-seeing generally in the sense that he observes all things, although that's true. He's also the God who sees you personally. He knows everything about you. He's not a distant deity just sort of scanning the masses of heaven, kind of keeping general tabs on humanity, sending his angels out every once in a while to make sure, things are running the way they should. He's the God who finds this frightened, pregnant, runaway slave girl in a desert, sees her, hears her affliction, gives her direction, gives her comfort, gives her a blessing. And Hagar's story is not just an isolated case. It's the opening note of a melody that runs through all of Scripture and reaches its fulfillment in Jesus. So I just want to make a couple of points of application for you. First, there's a word of comfort here, that God sees you first in your sorrow. What God did for Hagar, he did for the entire nation of Israel. Because the same words of oppression and affliction are used throughout the book of Exodus to talk about Israel's affliction. When Israel was enslaved in Egypt under Pharaoh, God said to Moses, Exodus chapter 3, in verse 7, I have surely seen the affliction of my people. I know their sufferings. He can do it for an entire nation. He can do it for one person. Throughout the Psalms, if you turn with me to the book of Psalms, in Psalm 10, the prayers of the trampled saints rest on the confidence that God sees them. Look in Psalm 10 with me in verse 12, where the psalmist calls upon God to act. Arise, O Lord, verse 12. O God, lift up your hand, forget not the afflicted. Why does the wicked renounce God and say in his heart, you will not call to account? But you do see, for you note mischief and vexation, that you may take it into your hands. To you the helpless commits himself. You have been the helper of the fatherless. Break the arm of the wicked and evildoer. Call his wickedness to account till you find him, or till you find none. So here's God who sees his affliction. He sees the evil that's being done to him. And the psalmist is saying, God, I know you see this. Please do something about it. How about Psalm chapter 34 in verse 18? Where David, again, is afflicted, but he's reminding us that you need to turn, and like I did, you need to turn and taste and see that the Lord is good. He says several beautiful things, but one of the things he says in verse 18 is, the Lord is near to the brokenhearted. He saves the crushed in spirit. He knows their situation. He's close to those people. How about Psalm 56 in verse 8, another beautiful expression of God's intimate knowledge of our sorrow and our difficulty. Here David says in verse 8 to God in his prayer, God, you have kept count of my tossings. Put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? You've had a sleepless night before because of something you're struggling with. You're tossing and you're turning, perhaps even you're crying. God counts every time you roll over in your bed. All of those hours of sleep that you missed out on, God knows. And the beautiful thing is that he doesn't just sympathize with hurting people. That'd be one thing. But this transcendent God, this sovereign Lord of the universe, who created all things with the breath of his mouth, he not only sympathizes, he empathizes with us. Parents, you understand when you love your kids so much and they get hurt, how you feel that hurt with them. That's our God. He hurts when we hurt. He said in Isaiah chapter 63 in verse 9 of his people, in all their affliction, in all of Israel's affliction and trouble, he was afflicted too. So if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever felt that nobody sees you, nobody cares for you, I want you to know that at the very least, God sees you. God cares for you. You're not just another face in the crowd to Jesus. He knows you by name. He knows exactly what you're going through, and he wants to help you through it. That should be a word of comfort, that God sees you in your sorrow. But there's also a word of conviction here that goes along with it, that God sees you in your sin too. So the Bible also affirms this, doesn't it? Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 13 says that no creature is hidden from his sight, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give account. He sees us. His vision is comforting on the one hand, but isn't it also a little bit terrifying? Because sometimes when we think no one is looking, we do things that are selfish, that are mean, and that are unjust. And we need to know that God sees that too. But here's the good news that goes along with that bad news, is that even while we are sinners, God's love pursues us. In fact, Jesus came. Isaiah chapter 53 tells us to bear our griefs. He came to carry our sorrows, but he also came to be pierced for our transgressions, to be crushed for our iniquities, to be oppressed, to be afflicted, both with us, to comfort us, also for us, to save us. Do you know, one time when Jesus walked the earth, he sent his disciples to go into this town. And it was in the middle part of the day. It was really, really hot. And people would come out to wells to get their water at either the beginning or the end of the day when it was kind of cool outside. They didn't go in the middle part of the day. Well, Jesus is sitting by this well, and he's weary from his journey. And here comes this woman all by herself out to this well. And Jesus strikes up a conversation with her. And he sees right away who she is. He knows everything about this woman, and he doesn't reveal that until a little bit deeper into the conversation. But just like Hagar, this woman that Jesus was talking to had been rejected, kind of an outcast in society. She had a very messy past. And Jesus revealed that he knew everything about her life, all of her past marriages, all of that he knew about. And yet, before he revealed this special knowledge of her secret personal life, Jesus offered her grace. He offered her living water. See, the things that we try to hide from other people, we can never hide from God. And yet, despite seeing us from top to bottom, from the inside out, he still loves us, and he offers us a better way. One last thing here. There's a word of challenge, too. God sees you in your sorrow. He sees you in your sin, but he also sees you in your service. I think knowing that God sees everything I do, doesn't that free us from any pretense in our worship? Any need to be acknowledged for the good things that we're doing? Any desire for an earthly reward for your faith? Jesus promises us that when we practice our devotion to God from the heart and not for show, he says that your Father, who sees in secret, will reward you. He was talking about all of those religious show-offs who were just doing nice things for other people, or just showing off their great knowledge of God's word, or fasting to show how devoted they were to God and telling everyone about it. It's the modern day equivalent of someone doing a kind deed and then posting on Instagram about it or something. He says that's all. Those people have their reward, the claps of human beings. But if you serve God in secret, know that God sees it and he'll reward you. A reward that will go beyond this life. It's very liberating to live life this way. I mean, when you have the approval of the judge of the universe, you tend not to care too much about what other people think, good or bad. This well was named the Living One Who Sees Me, Bir Lahai Roy, so that every traveler who stopped to take a drink would be reminded that there was a God who was looking out for them. And there is a God who looks out for you. We're like those travelers a little bit today. We've stopped for a drink at this well. And you need to know that God sees you. And if God really does see you, well, then shouldn't that change the way that we live our life and the way that we think about things? We should let this truth comfort us in our sorrow, because Jesus came in the flesh. He knows the pain that you're going through. Let it convict you in your sin. Because Jesus died on the cross, he can offer you grace, a better way to live. And let it challenge you in your service, because Jesus rose from the dead. Nothing that you do for him will ever be in vain. We might add just one more. Compassion. If God sees us and cares for us in this way, shouldn't it change the way that we see other people? Shouldn't we be a seeing people too? And go and help people when they feel alone, when they need comforted. So may God help us to see him as the God who sees us. I don't know where this lands with you this morning, which one of these three kind of points resonates with you. But I hope that it's encouraged you to know God a little bit better, to serve God a little more fully. And if you need the prayers of this church, you need to respond to the gospel in some visible way. Maybe you want to become a Christian today, and we can help you with that if you come forward while we stand up and sing together.